Hey guys, welcome back to the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a guest episode with Brandon Cruz. So this is our second installment in our monthly episodes that him and I will be doing together and collaborating on that will be on both of our podcasts. So again, I know if you've listened to this podcast, you know who Brandon is, but make sure you go and follow his podcast, the Chasing Clarity podcast, as this episode will also be on there as well too. So again, make sure you listen to that. And so in this episode, him and I discuss the many benefits of eating at maintenance. So we talk about, first, we dive into what's been going on with our training, nutrition. We discuss my blood work, dive into that a little bit, what I'm changing with my training. And then the same thing with Brandon. We talk about that a little bit in terms of his training. And then we dive into around the 30-ish minute mark around eating, the many benefits of eating at maintenance. We talk about maintenance calories versus just maintaining and the difference between maintenance phases and maintenance calories, the metabolic benefits of maintenance, the physiological benefits of maintenance, the behavioral benefits, the psychological. And then we really dive into when to use maintenance calories, when would be the best times to use that. And I think that's really a good wrap up here. We also dive into special notes on women in terms of their caloric intake there. And so make sure you listen to the full episode to hear that there. So again, this was a fun episode. This is our second installment of that. We haven't decided. We think we're going to go back to Q&A style, but we'll probably flip flat back and forth. And if there is a topic him and I come up with, we'll definitely discuss that. So again, if you guys have any questions specifically for him and I, make sure you reach out to one of us on Instagram to ask that. And if you want us to cover a specific topic or question, make sure you send that in. So hope you guys enjoy this episode. First though, before we dive into it, I have my one-on-one coaching. So if you guys are interested in taking your training, nutrition, performance, maybe, and you want to feel better, you want to look better, then my one-on-one coaching is for you. And again, if you want to learn more about that, you can click the link in the show notes or reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff HOE, to find out more. And again, if you listen to this episode, make sure, and you found it to be helpful, make sure you tag Brandon and I in it on social media. So that's it. Enjoy this episode. Talk to you guys.
What's going on, guys? This is Brandon Cruz, host of the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. And I've got my good friend with me, Jeff Hain, host of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Jeff and I are back for episode 2 of our monthly podcast collaboration, where each month we will answer your questions and dive into topics that will benefit both of our audiences. And this is going to be applicable whether you're a coach like ourselves, you're a fitness enthusiast, you're one of our clients, or you're just someone that's simply chasing a healthier, leaner, and more muscular physique. And this series between the two of us is all about bridging the gap between evidence and real-world application. So we'll be tackling everything from training and nutrition to recovery, lifestyle strategies, and anything else that helps you look, feel, and perform your best. So Jeff, let's start off by doing a quick catch-up on how things have been going from a training, nutrition, and business perspective, my man.
Yeah, dude. Pumped to do this again. I got really good feedback from the first one. So excited to do this. I just knew I knew that was going to be the case. I knew people were going to love it. Pumped to do this again and keep this going, man. I was looking forward to this, especially the topic we're going to discuss today. But yeah, dude. So from a training perspective, yeah, I think big things is so one thing that I'm sure you're this way, I just want to try and at this point, like I want to continue to build muscle, but I also want to just test some things out and see how it works and be able to share that with people on my followers, clients, et cetera. And one thing I want to try this time, because I really have gotten the itch to do, I think we talked about this last time, to do conditioning, to build up my cardiovascular fitness. And so I went deep down that at the beginning of this kind of phase that I'm in. And then I'm like, you know what? I do miss some hypertrophy training. So then I did, I think somewhere around 12 to 16-ish weeks where I was doing 4 days, went back up to 4 days from 3 days. And now I'm like, okay, what I want to try is a volume cycling / frequency cycling of where now I'm going to go into a phase for like 6 to 10-ish weeks or so where I'm going to now go back to 3 days of weight training and bump up the cardio. And my thought here is, okay, I just want to test this out to see now that I've been put on some muscle. I feel bigger. I've put on a little bit of weight during this time, like controlled weight. Like I feel like my body composition's good. And so now I'm like, all right, now I want to see if I can spend a little bit more time, if you're looking at a dial towards conditioning, to see what that does, right? I just want to see if that's something that can help me prolong this phase, feel better, maybe keep metabolic health in a good spot while continuing to build my conditioning, and also potentially get some benefits of cycling volume a little bit from like a hypertrophy standpoint. And so that's what I'm switching to now for the next 6 to 8 weeks, 6 to 10-ish weeks. We'll see how things go. So that's one big change that I'm having there with that. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Now, let me ask you, when you're saying cycling volume, right now you're downshifting and decreasing volume due to the decrease in frequency. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Just naturally.
Most people, when they hear volume cycling, they're going to think of either James Krieger, who is big on volume cycling, Mike Zerdos, or Dr. Mike Israetel, where it's a volume cycling, but it's a progressive escalation in volume. So I just wanted to make sure that the audience is aware you're actually decreasing volume so that you could essentially be able to allocate more of your adaptive recovery and performance resources towards conditioning and towards aerobic training, and really making that your 1A, and then resistance training and hypertrophy training will be your 1B for this specific mesocycle.
Yep. And my thought on that is I can give my body a little bit of a break from not that my training's super high in hypertrophy right now, but I can give my body a little bit of a break. Plus, knowing what I know about hypertrophy, it's like you can get away with doing less than you think, and you're not going to necessarily go backwards, right? So now it's like, hey, I'm just switching that to more that's closer to maintenance, and now conditioning is a little bit more towards progressing, right? And so that, but again, it also gives my body a break from a stimulus standpoint. And is there science behind this and that this is going to work? I don't think that there's necessarily any science around volume cycling for sure. I think it's mixed in terms of that, or maybe not good research around it. But I think there is something to potentially being able to do that, not only from a physiological standpoint, but a psychological standpoint too, to switch it up from that point. And doing cardiovascular, like improving your cardiovascular fitness should help with recovery, whatnot too. So I'm hoping to kind of get the benefits of that too, and all the other benefits of building cardiovascular fitness. So looking forward to give that a shot and just testing that cycling approach out of, or I guess it would just be periodization, right? Just guising cardio and hypertrophy. And then I'll go back to 4 days and just see what happens there and see what happens from a results standpoint, right? Because like I said, is this going to for sure work? I don't know. At this point in time, it's like just testing it out and then seeing if it's something that I can apply, and obviously share my results with other people around it.
Absolutely.
And it's just fun too.
I think something that's really important to hit on, at this point, this will be my 21st year of training. And there have been many points in my life that I wanted to do what was optimal on paper, or what was optimal based on the information that I was gathering, the research I was doing, or the mentors that were influencing me. So I've worked with everyone from John Meadows to I've went to training camps with Joe Bennett and Ben Pekulski. I've done in-person seminars with the likes of Eugene Teo, like people that were very big into the hypertrophy training. One of my mentors is Dr. Scott Stevenson of Fortitude Training. And I've also done extensive mentorships with Chris Beardsley. And I've tried all these different training philosophies. But I think that one thing that held me back maybe 10 or 12 years ago, especially like when I was really into competing, was that if it wasn't what I thought was optimal in that moment, it almost was like a sunk cost fallacy where I was not willing to experiment. And as I've gotten deeper into my training career and have also gotten away from bodybuilding, where there is something at stake in your mind in terms of the stage presence and the stage performance, I've been much more willing to experiment with things, to take on different types of training methodologies and strategies, because perhaps they may not be appropriate for me, but I can test them out, and I also really what it comes down to is data tracking, because I'm very comprehensive in terms of my data tracking. We went through my fat loss phases and all these things. I will look at literature behind it. I will test it in the trenches. I will be very comprehensive in my data tracking and then my analysis process. And so it has often allowed me, even these experimental things that may not have been like the most conducive. We look at it on like a time scale by time scale basis, 12 weeks of this training versus, or usually my blocks are 16 weeks. So 16 weeks of this training versus 16 weeks of this training. It may not have been like the experimental one may not have been the most conducive towards muscle growth or physique development. But a lot of times I've learned a lot in that process. So there's been certain training cycles where I've utilized, I'm personally more of an advocate of higher frequency, but I've done decreased frequency and lower frequency and seen that it has had certain advantages or certain upsides in terms of joint integrity, different, just not dealing with as much niggles and things of that sort. And then it's allowed me to utilize it with clients that come to me already predisposed or dealing with those issues. So I think at this point in our career, I'll tell you, I'll just speak for myself. My career is much more important than my personal physique progress. Like my clients' progress, I put that over anything because I actually get more of a fulfillment and more joy and dopamine hit out of them making gains than myself. Also, I think that also is confounded by the fact that I'm making gains much slower than many of my clients. And so I think that it's great that you're trying something different, because this is a learning opportunity for you to be in the trenches, to try it yourself and to see what works and doesn't work, but also being able to take notes of these different physiological, psychological, and just behavioral changes that you're going through, and then being able to walk the walk and also be able to relate to the clients that you may potentially bring through this in later phases.
Yeah, dude, absolutely, man. I think we've talked about this a ton in the past too, about just, hey, knowing the research is great, but then also I think testing things on yourself and being in the trenches is just super important. And living through your experiences, I think is in testing it out, I think is just super important. But yeah, dude, I think also too, like real quick, I don't want to keep harping on this because I do want to quickly go tell you my blood work, just to kind of get your thoughts on it. But I also think too that as like body weight climbs and you add more muscle, I think it's even more important to like make sure you do some sort of conditioning conditioning and cardiovascular stimulus, right? As that continues to go up. So again, that's part of it as well too, right? As to why I want to bring some of this in. And this is coming from the guy that literally, dude, back in my building phases, I was like, I'm getting like 5,000 steps because if I expend too much energy, that's not going to be good for muscle growth. No cardio, right? So it's complete 180 from what I used to do in these phases. But yeah, man. So I know we talked last time. I think I had just gotten it drawn or I was about to, but I got it back. Overall, everything was like super, super solid. My total testosterone was good. It was 707.
Okay.
Free
Yeah.
test.
So
Go ahead.
above the middle of the range. If we look at the range, it's usually 2 something, 230, or maybe it might be 216 to 916 or something, 230 to 916 at this point. They keep changing it, so it's hard to keep up with. But usually it's like 300 to 900 we're looking at. So you're at the upper end of the range, which for someone in their mid 30s that trains hard, completely natural. I think that's great.
Yeah, I was surprised. I didn't know what to expect with that. I was like, yeah, I think as a male, you're always, I think my testosterone should be higher. So I didn't know for sure. But then free test came back and it was 10. So when you look at the actual reference range, it's still on the lower end. And I think when you look at the functional range, it still is on the lower end from that. And my SHBG was actually was not really high, but it was pretty high there.
Now,
Which
do you know if that free test was actually taken or was it a back calculation that they provided you? Because at
that's
some labs, they
it
don't
says
actually,
direct.
Okay.
So does that mean it was actually taken then, right? If it says it's direct?
That would mean, yeah,
Okay.
they actually tested it. Because sometimes they will do, and they do the same thing with HOMA IR. They'll do a back calculation for HOMA IR, which is homeostatic model of insulin resistance. They do that based off oftentimes like your fasting insulin and your blood glucose values on blood work. So the same thing could be said. Sometimes what they'll do is you can do this actually online. You can look up a free testosterone calculator and you could add in the total testosterone and then also the binding protein. So if you have SHBG, sometimes you could do it with albumin. So anything that's going to bind up and essentially what we're looking for is the unbound testosterone that can exert its actions on actual cells, which is the free testosterone. Just like the same concept would be with free T3 and free T4. What are the active free hormones in the serum that can exert their actions, in the case of thyroid, on these cells and do so in a metabolically active way?
Yeah. Looking at the actual free part of it, because my understanding that is ultimately what's going to drive like how you would actually feel. In my understanding, SHBG, the higher it is, it bounds up, makes testosterone bound up a little bit, right? Potentially there.
Yeah, without a doubt. The one thing with what we usually see is that most men will be able to convert, on average, 2% of their total testosterone into free testosterone. So I just did the calculation. So for you, based off of, you said 707, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that would be a little over 14. So you're a little bit low in that range. Obviously, they're going to give you like an optimal range as well as what they see from a reference population perspective. So it just may be modulating that SHBG. That could be done through supplementation, especially like boron supplementation is quite effective at lowering SHBG specifically.
But you also don't necessarily want to drive HSBG down completely too, right?
No, so that is a misconception. Actually, if you look in the bodybuilding world, a lot of individuals used to, so I'll just give an analogy from bodybuilding. They used to try to, just like with estradiol, they used to use a lot of aromatase inhibitors to drive estradiol down. Now we know that estrogen, or specifically estradiol, which is E2, which we would get pulled on labs, is cardioprotective, it's renal protective, it's brain protective. There's so many benefits of estrogen, especially in a healthy range. And when you are at super physiological doses of testosterone, such as in the case of someone that's enhanced in bodybuilding, you should have higher than normal estradiol. So you don't need to suppress that. So that's the first thing. But secondarily, there used to be this, I don't want to say this lore, but essentially this mindset or this perspective that you wanted SHBG as low as possible. Now, this is not something I could speak at depth with, but there is something else called the megalin receptor, which actually you need enough of SHBG to actually circulate your testosterone. So you want it, as with many things in life, no one wants to hear this because it's not sexy. Just like when we say it depends, no one wants to hear that. But it really is about having these hormones in a Goldilocks zone. We don't want them too high, but we don't want them too low. But it could be just the simple modification or modulation of getting SHBG down into more of the moderate or low normal range that would help with increasing testosterone or free testosterone. But then again, we got to go back to, you're not your labs. That was a one single time point reference. So if you're not feeling any indices of low energy or fatigue or recovery issues or libido issues, this may not be something that you have to modify or really manipulate right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll always come back to like, how do you actually feel? But before, so then looking at my thyroid markers, T3 was a little bit on the, when you look at the functional range, it was on the lower end, and then reverse T3 was on the higher end of the functional range. And so like because again, also like you said, looking at how you feel, but then also it's like looking at everything. What's it pointing towards? And then also, this is the first time I got it. So are these trending up? Are they it's like looking at that too, and seeing that is super important. So like my takeaway from this was, you mentioned, hey, how do you feel? I have noticed recovery is probably a little bit slower. Like I don't like with training, I still enjoy it, but I do have to get myself up to go and do it a bit more. We talked about that last time. So it made me think, okay, probably my biggest lowest or my lowest hanging fruit here is sleep, and just better, like just trying to get a little bit more sleep, right? Because I think all those things that I mentioned there would probably fix, or at least get those into that even more functional range on there. So that was my takeaway. It's just, hey, to me, it just read someone that is trying to train 6-7 days a week, trying to manage a business, trying to be a father, not necessarily getting as optimal sleep as before. And that's where I'm at. And that's what I took away from it. Hey, I want to train this much, but I also need to, because of that, I need to make sure that recovery is there. Otherwise you can run into issues, but I also don't have previous labs to go off of. So yeah.
Yes. And I think that's the most important thing. So if you actually look in the literature on testosterone values, the reason why, if someone is going to be hypogonadal, so they're going to be labeled as being hypogonadal, meaning they have a clinical deficiency in testosterone, they need to be measured multiple times, because there's actually not only a diurnal variation in testosterone. So say, for instance, you got measured your first time at 7 a.m. and your next time at 10 a.m. Like there could be differences just based on the diurnal pulses of testosterone throughout the course of the day. Your values in the morning are not going to be the same as your values at night. So that's the first thing, that we have to essentially standardize the approach that we're utilizing to lab work in terms of how you approach it nutritionally, how you approach it from a training perspective, how you approach it supplementation wise. A lot of supplements, especially multivitamins, micronutrients, things like that, they can alter certain lab values, especially from a thyroid perspective. So that's something you have to be cognizant of. Secondarily, I forget the actual percentage points, but there is a natural variation between testosterone pulls, where even when they've done controlled trials where they pull labs off the same person the same day and the same time, and they test it and they send it to different labs, or even to the same lab, but in 2 samples, you will see a difference. I forget what the percentage is, but I believe it was around 5%. But let's say it is 5%. That means that any of these values could be off by a pretty substantial margin of error. So we have to take that in consideration when looking at time points and values across time, and really what we're looking for. And I think this is why I've been successful in blood work. I've always been interested in blood work, but I've been able to help a lot of individuals, is I'm always looking at patterns. First and foremost, I'm really good at recognizing patterns, and then also triangulating data. I'm never looking at one single time point in isolation. I'm always looking at the totality of the data and making sure that we are not making preemptive like jumps and leaps towards a clinical deficiency or an issue if we don't have the full picture. First and foremost, we don't have previous data, and we don't have a historical time course of that person's changes in nutrition, training, sleep, stress, all of these things. It's an amalgamation. So it's never about isolating one thing. Sometimes I'll have people come to me for consults, blood work consults in particular, and like they're hyper fixated on one single value. And when I look at the entirety of the labs, it's in everything else is like in a really good place. And you're hyper fixated. And this could literally be an anomaly, or it could be like an error. Like their labs are just as open to human error as we are. So I think it's always important to zoom out and look at things in the grand scheme of things, especially when it comes to something like your health, your fitness. It's the same thing as if you were to have a performance decrement in a day where you just felt terrible, and maybe you didn't have poor sleep the night before. It was just an anomaly. It was just abnormality that you had this. If you were to hyperfixate on that and think, oh, I need a deload, like you would be making preemptive and proactive changes that aren't really indicative of where you are in this time period, nor would it be beneficial to your long-term progression and progress. So I think it's really important to not hyperfixate and not hyperfocus on singular time points and singular pieces of data.
Yeah, dude, absolutely. And like you said, looking at the overall pattern, and then where is it trending too? Because like you said, that's super important. And like you just said there, it's like you can get this different testosterone readings depending on which lab it's going to as well too. So It's like just so many things, man. So cool, dude. That's it on me, man. Love to hear about what's been going on with your training and in life and everything like that.
Yeah, so I'll keep my update short because we have a lot to get into today. But I'm currently 17 weeks into my building phase, and I've just been aiming to execute 100% across the board. I'm really dialed in terms of my training, my nutrition, my supplementation, and especially my sleep and stress management. This may sound odd to say, but I'm not someone who partakes in like dopamine driving activities. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do any of these like illicit activities. But I will tell you that there's nothing that gives me a larger like dopamine secretion and hit then continuing to stack successful executed days of my plan on top of one another. And I know that really when it comes down to it, like on the day to day, it's very hard to see progress. I'm 20 plus years into this. It's not like I'm going to see visual progress on a day to day or week to week or a month to month basis, but I really know that as long as I'm continuing to string together consistent days and weeks at a time, it will pay off, especially because I plan to start a cut in June and I want to do like a photo shoot prep. I would really love to do that with my significant other, Jane. We wanted to do so last year, but we ended up moving during the same time period that we were going to do the photo shoot. And then we ended up at Sam Miller's conference. So I prioritized my business over the photo shoot. I want to get that done. And I really want us to get some great pictures done. So I'm looking forward to that first and foremost, but everything on the training and nutrition front are going really well. Then on the business front, man, it's going extremely well. I'm very excited because right now we're already in March, which is crazy because I feel like we just recorded last week and it was the beginning of February. So like the season is really coming towards us in terms of spring. And spring has always been a very busy and productive season for me, especially from a coaching perspective. So for the last, I would say 6 to 8 weeks, I've been trying to get as many podcasts recorded, especially for Chasing Clarity, like in advance, but I've also scheduled in multiple podcast appearances per week this winter, as I know that once this spring is here, my time's going to be limited. So I really wanted to ensure that I had a lot of high quality episodes. I've been able to do a lot of guest episodes, a lot of guest interviews. So I had that locked in and loaded. So I'm excited to release those. But overall, man, really excited with how everything has been going personally and professionally. And I'm looking forward to making the most out of the coming months. And especially because spring has always just been just such a great season for me. Like I'm someone that responds really well to like warmer weather. And especially now that I'm in the greater Nashville area where it'll be 80 degrees by the time spring comes around. I'm looking forward to that, but everything on my end is going and I'm looking forward to having a very productive spring season.
That's awesome, dude. Sorry, when did you move down to Nashville again?
So that was the fall of 2024.
2024. So you were there last spring then. So you've already, okay. I didn't, okay.
It was such a difference from now, just so obviously, but the audience, I lived between Jersey and New York for the entirety of my life, essentially. And I did travel quite extensively for my corporate career. So I was in different areas throughout the course of the year, but spring in Jersey is super rainy. And the same thing with New York, it's still cold. And like right now, so for instance, I was on the phone with my mom earlier this week and it was 36 degrees and here it was 71. So there's a massive difference and we're close to spring. It's just a change of weather, but also with the mood that comes along with it. I'm someone that really likes the outdoors. If I'm not like inside on a computer or on a podcast, like I'm outdoors trying to do activities, hiking, going into trails, going into nature. That's something my dog loves. So it's activities like that I really look forward to. And the warm weather just allocates the ability to do that on a more frequent basis. So those are things that I live for, being able to put away my phone, my laptop for an hour or two at a time and just getting out into nature.
Yeah, dude, you need it, man. I definitely realized that in the last 5-10 years, how important it is getting outside. I freaking love being outside as much as I can too. So I love when the weather changes like this and stuff. Real quick though, I'm curious. I don't know if you ever talked about it. And I don't know if you supplement wise, what do you typically take there? What does that look like? Does it depend on, again, blood work or what do you typically take in there?
Yeah, just as a caveat here, I spent over 10 years in the supplement industry. So a lot of what I do supplementation wise is very targeted. It is based off of my biofeedback, my blood work, and then also certain things that I'm working towards within a phase. So right now I have very basic things in. So I'm using high dose creatine. Anytime that I have under 6 hours of sleep, I will utilize 20 grams of creatine. If not, I'm using a daily dose of 10 grams, which I separate it out into 2 doses. I like to use a lot of supplements that are more so replacements, not for food exactly, but they're food first types of nutrients. So for instance, I utilize a lot of highly bright cyclic dextrin in terms of my intra workout. And that is a high molecular weight, low osmolarity carbohydrate that helps with increasing glycogen replenishment. It helps with fueling during training. And it's just very effective, especially that it sits so easy on the gut. So I utilize that intra workout with some electrolytes. That's something I'm a big fan of. I utilize magnesium pulse throughout the course of the day. I'm also a big fan just because I have a high stress burden and high stress load. Luckily, I can manage it well, but I do believe in the strategic use of supplementation. So I will often utilize in the morning. If I'm not utilizing nootropics, like on a very high workload day, I will utilize something like a rhodiola, which helps with stress management, also helps with delaying or essentially reducing fatigue. I'm also a fan of in the evenings, I'll often, if I have a very stressful day, I will utilize ashwagandha and specifically the KSM 66 version, which interestingly enough, one of the companies I worked for, I pushed for that to come out to, and we were one of the first brands in the US that really got that. So I was privy to the early research on that. And it's been amazing to see how it's transitioned into many other capacities. They're seeing increases in testosterone, increases in, there's some body composition research on it, but really I was always very focused on the cortisol quenching effects of KSM the stress reduction effects. It has some ability to enhance sleep, but that's more so due to helping you downshift into a parasympathetic state. So I utilize ingredients like that. I'm trying to think anything else. Obviously, I do a lot of multivitamin and multi-nutrient. I do have hypothyroidism, so I tend to supplement with very specific things like very high quality selenium extracts. I will make sure that I have some type of iodine source, whether that's through iodine sea salt or I'll utilize like an iodine supplement. So yeah, it really is heavily dependent on my blood work. The one thing that I do utilize as my food gets higher, because I am someone that has a very adaptive metabolism, meaning I have to very much increase my food. And right now I'm sitting at about 600 grams of carbohydrates a day. Now, we discussed last time about blood glucose. I am someone that is hyper focused on blood glucose. And that is something I've been tracking for 20 plus years. My father was a type 2 diabetic. And people will say, oh, that's a lifestyle disease. Absolutely. But if you have multiple people in your family, I also have diabetics in my family. So if you have multiple people in your family that have been predisposed towards insulin resistance, hyperlipidemia, hypercholesterolemia, like these metabolic syndrome criteria, you are more likely to fall in that category as well. And so during times that I'm utilizing higher carbohydrates, I will utilize things like berberine hydrochloride at very high potency. I actually use a DHB, which is dihydroberberine, which is essentially 5 times as bioavailable. And so it doesn't cause as many of the GI related effects as berberine. So berberine has many uses. We can use that it's not a glucose disposal agent just independently, but it helps with glucose control. It helps with insulin sensitivity and things like that. And it works very comparative or very similar to metformin, which is the number 1 prescribed type 2 diabetic medication as of the last few years. But honestly, at this point, GLP-1s might be taking that over. So I need to look back into that. But berberine also has antibacterial effects, which can be used in a gut health regimen, essentially. And so that I'm not trying to use it for. I am trying to get the benefits from an insulin sensitivity, glycemic control perspective. So what I use is a concentrated form that gets absorbed into the gastrointestinal tract much easier. So I'm able to use the efficacious dose per dose of berberine is often 500 milligrams. I can use 100 milligrams of a berberine dihydroberberine. And now I actually beta tested that before it ever came to market. So I have like extensive experience with a lot of these things. And I actually went through a period where I was purposely trying to induce insulin resistance to see the effects of dihydroberberine. That's an experiment we'll talk about another day, but It's potent in terms of its efficacy. So that is something that I use during this time period. But besides that, man, it comes down to simple things like caffeine. I really like the basics, essentially, creatine, caffeine. Now, there are some other sexier things, but that's really on a specific time point basis that I may utilize those products. And oftentimes speaking about them, like I'm the person that I spent a decade plus in the supplement industry, but you'll rarely hear me talk about or promote supplements because I really do. First and foremost, I'm a nutritionist. I believe in a food first approach, and I will always prioritize food and the whole food matrix over anything else.
Yeah, dude. No, absolutely. You really don't talk about supplements very much, what you take. That's why I was asking, because you really don't. And again, that's the importance of, like you said, lifestyle and food first. But yeah, dude, rhodiola, I think, is definitely like a undervalued supplement for sure. I used that when Colby was born. I'm definitely going to use it again when baby number 2 is born for sure, because I definitely felt better and was able to manage it. And then obviously creatine too. But rhodiola, dude, don't sleep on that one for sure, especially for, like you said. So cool, man. Let's dive into the topic.
Absolutely. All right. So the main topic for today is going to be the many benefits of eating at maintenance. And maintenance is one of the most overlooked concepts in the nutrition and fitness industry. And as a result, very few people acknowledge the many metabolic, physiological, behavioral, and psychological benefits that can come from spending time eating at maintenance. In the fitness space, most conversations revolve around 2 things. People talk about being in a calorie deficit to lose body fat, or they talk about being in a calorie surplus trying to build muscle. But very rarely do people speak about the value of intentionally spending time eating at maintenance. And part of the reason for this is that many people have incorrectly associated eating at maintenance while being stagnant. They assume that if they aren't actively in a deficit or surplus, then they must not be making progress. So being at maintenance calories gets viewed as a period where you're not being productive towards your goals. But in reality, this couldn't be further from the truth. Spending time eating at maintenance can provide a wide range of metabolic, physiological, behavioral, and psychological benefits that actually help support long-term body composition progress. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. So Jeff, before I start this off by going over the metabolic benefits of eating at maintenance, I'd love to hear your thoughts on why so many people in this space neglect to discuss maintenance as much as they do deficits and surpluses.
Yeah, dude. Like you said, I think the big thing is people think maintenance means that they're not making progress. And like you said, that's further from the truth, right? We talk about this off air, but separating maintenance calories from like maintenance of a maintenance phase, right? That doesn't mean you're standing still. If anything, and as we're going to talk about today, you still can make a ton of progress eating at maintenance calories, right? So I think that's the first thing that we need to establish is there's a difference between maintenance, not going anywhere, and like a maintenance phase versus eating at maintenance calories. Because I don't know how you think of this, but like for me, I'm like, for depending on where you're at, but for a lot of people, like eating at maintenance during a building phase is definitely something that we would do at times, again, depending on certain things and what it looks like, right? So I think that's the very first thing is people, just like you said, think that maintenance means they're not going anywhere, but it's, man, that's different from eating at maintenance calories. I think that's a big thing too, though, is, and maybe we need to hit on this, is like, what maintenance calories, I think people think that it's like you're at this like one specific number and you're at this one specific weight, right? And I think that's where maybe people get lost with maintenance, and they think that it's just like one specific number and one calorie target, right? Whereas, hey, both of those could change over time in terms of maintenance calories and also your kind of maintenance there. And I think it's a range. I think the weight is a range, right? Your maintenance weight would be a range there. And I think it can also, and I'm sure we'll hit on this, but it can also like you can also see your weight trend up over time at maintenance calories too, right? If you're adding some muscle and things like that too. Those are just a few things there that I see. And yeah.
I'll just hit on this before I get into some of the benefits. First and foremost, it is very important for us to disentangle the concept or the act of eating at maintenance calories and the concept of maintaining where we are currently. They're not one and the same. Maintenance calories is a time to get you back up to energy balance and to fuel the goal specific or the specific goals that you're looking to achieve. That could be restoring after a fat loss phase. That could be looking to induce body recomposition, which is the simultaneous increase in lean mass and decrease in fat mass. Or it could be that you are looking to have a very strategic lean building approach. And we see in the literature, I'm going to be releasing a podcast with Dr. Eric Helms soon. So this may have come out by the time that we release this one, where we discuss his recent study, which was a lean bulking study, where they looked at maintenance versus a 5% surplus versus a 15% surplus. Now, in actuality, the two surplus groups ended up almost like overlapping with one another in terms of the actual surplus that they induced. But when we look at it and we look at all three groups, there was no significant difference in muscle mass gains between the three. So even that group that was at maintenance for the entire 8-week duration, which they actually gained 0.9 pounds during that period, they did not see any diminished effects from a actual lean mass accretion perspective being at maintenance. And these were intermediate trainees. There were some advanced individuals in the cohort, but we would say they're intermediate. There are many people, and most of the individuals that I work with are intermediate trainees that are trying to either get a little bit to a more advanced intermediate or to the advanced stage. And a lot of times they're not going to benefit from a massive surplus. So what we could do is a lot of times I will start off in a primer phase, and priming or primer phase is essentially I'm trying to improve their internal physiology and get their body to be more responsive. And often the best way to do that is to get them at maintenance, to improve their habits, behaviors, really dial in their training, drive body composition improvements through training performance improvements. And then I start with the modification and the manipulation of energy balance in and of itself, whether I'm trying to induce greater lean mass accretion. So maybe I'm starting to increase calories and work their calories up as they become their energy expenditure levels increase. Or if we're looking to more dry fat loss, then I will tiptoe them into a slight deficit to be able to drive. But really the goal is body recomposition. But anytime I do a body recomp phase or a primer phase, I start at maintenance. And that is one of the phases that often unlocks a level of progress that many people have yet to see. So to misextrapolate or to misunderstand and really lump one and two in the same in terms of maintenance calories and then maintenance of body composition progress is just really a fallacy of the fitness industry, where a lot of times the vernacular that we use is incorrect. So a great example of this is we'll often use the term, or many fitness professionals, I'm very cautious about using this. They'll say that we're overtraining. You have more of a likelihood of getting hit by lightning outside than you do overtraining from a resistance training perspective. There is a great review, a 2020 review by Grandow and colleagues, and they put these guys through the fucking trenches in terms of it's brutal training programs. And in the majority of studies, they're unable to induce any type of overtraining effect. And so a lot of times the fitness industry, people will throw away these trite statements like, oh, you're overtraining. And it's that they're misusing the terminology. And the same thing could be said about the way that people utilize and then also view maintenance. So that's really why we're on this podcast. We want to be able to really inform you guys, educate you, and empower you with that education so that you realize that maintenance is not something that you need to turn away from, run away from, or try to avoid. It's actually a period in which you can garner so many benefits. So that is what we will be covering today.
Again, just to reiterate this, like Really, I'm almost driving this home. I feel like we've really beat this down, but like just driving the fact that eating at maintenance calories is just simply you're eating around your total daily energy expenditure, right? It's nothing more, nothing less. And there's positive benefits that can happen from doing that, right? And in a pot, and you can move forward at that, right? And so again, just make sure that if you take anything away from this episode, you separate those two there. I will say, I think the thing you need to look out for here at maintenance too is, and especially would be somebody who's been like dieting for a while or they're very conscious of their weight, is especially if they've been trying to restrict calories, is I find that the biggest challenge to getting people to truly being able to get to a good level of their total daily energy expenditure is actually like being okay with going from lower calorie amount and like your lowest scale weight to seeing it come up just a tiny bit, right? Like I think that's the biggest thing, because otherwise you see people get stuck in this no man's land where they're like, oh crap, weight went up 2 pounds. I'm not at maintenance because my weight didn't stay the exact same. Now I need to decrease my calories.
But that is not true. So if you actually look at the definition of maintenance, it's actually a 2 to 3% increase in body weight or range of body weight. So there's a great study by Stevens that looks at what is actually maintenance after a fat loss phase. And they don't get really into this specific part, but this is my interpretation. And also just from experience being in the trenches, you have to realize that your lowest body weight during a fat loss phase, you do not own that weight. That is not your true physiological weight. That is a depleted carbohydrate, completely stripped of carbohydrate, low water weight, and low gut residue body weight. So you are seeing an artificially low body weight during the end of your fat loss phase when you're on your lowest calories, your lowest food volume, you have your lowest amount of carbohydrate intake and lowest glycogen levels. Now we know that the average person can store between 400 to 600 grams of glycogen in the form of muscle glycogen and about 80 to 100 grams in liver glycogen. So if we take the averages of that, we could say 500. Let's go with 500 grams of muscle glycogen and 100 grams of liver glycogen. That is 600 grams. So on the scale right then and there, even if you just restored just the glycogen, you would be at 1.2 pounds increase. However, for every gram of glycogen stored, on average, it's 3 to 4 grams. So we do the calculation then, and we're looking at multiple kilos. When I've done the calculations in the past for many clients, a lot of times I'll draw this out or I'll map this out and I'll do the maths. And it comes out to about 6.6 pounds from someone's lowest weight until their glycogen restored weight. And also, what overlaps with that is I have done a lot of contest preps, both with myself and many other athletes. And oftentimes you'll see a swing of 4 to 7 pounds, depending on the size of the individual when you carbohydrate load them. However, it's very important for you guys to realize when I'm carb loading an athlete, it is not for them to gain fat. It is to get them to a level of muscular fullness where it improves their body composition. It would actually be counterproductive if we were to take them and get them into a very lean state and then have them gain fat before the competition. It would actually be counterproductive. So we're not increasing calories and increasing carbohydrates to gain fat. We are getting them into a glycogen restored state. So realize that often your body weight, so say you got down to 200 pounds in a fat loss phase, your real true weight is between that 200 pounds and 206, because that's a 3% range. And the same thing can be said about maintenance calories. It is not a stock standard or static number. It is going to be a range. And oftentimes it's 200-300 calories, depending on the person, depending on your activity levels, your training history, your training intensity, your sleep. There's so many factors that go into this. So we need to stop looking at things as one singular number in terms of your body weight maintenance and then also your maintenance calorie intake.
Yeah, dude. No, absolutely. But in that situation, right, you see a lot of people that they see it go up and now they're like, oh crap, I'm in a surplus. I got to go back and I got to get my weight back down. And then they end up being in this never ending cycle of now they're at, I guess we would call artificially low maintenance calories, right? Where it's, yeah, you might like you need to get over that kind of small increase on there. Cause like you said, all those things that you mentioned could be why you could see happen, right? So like you said, you could be 200 pounds and go up to 206. You didn't gain body fats, just like you said, restored glycogen. And if anything, then you, like you said, we said your total daily energy expenditure is probably lower than what it could be if you just are okay with seeing it come up a little bit, because there's adaptations upwards as well too, right? And I'm sure we'll get into that. But I also think you can see this on the opposite end too, where some people may think that like their maintenance calories are too high because they see their weight come up over time, but then you look and it's like they're also just not tracking very well, or they're having a lot of untracked meals, and now it's like their calories they're trending up, but it's really because of those things that are causing their weight to go up, not their maintenance calories are too high. And that could also lead to somebody, I think, eating from an actual maintenance standpoint there.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to get into the benefits of maintenance. And the first category of benefits that come from eating at maintenance are the physiological ones. But we're going to break this down a little bit more specifically. We're going to first go through the metabolic benefits of eating at maintenance. So eating at maintenance allows us to reverse the downregulation in total daily energy expenditure that occurs during a deficit. When someone spends an extended time period in a calorie deficit, we typically see a downregulation in all components of their total daily energy expenditure. And that's due to the diet-induced metabolic adaptations that occur when dropping body fat. But when we return to energy balance and we begin eating at maintenance again, so we increase our calories back up to what would sustain us, we often see these components of energy expenditure begin to increase. So, for example, the first thing that occurs when you go back to maintenance is you're going to have a higher thermic effect of feeding. Because when you start eating more food, your body now has more nutrients and more calories to digest, absorb, and process. And this increases diet-induced thermogenesis, or the thermic effect of food, which is essentially the number of calories that are burned through the digestion and process of nutrients. We also see an increase in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So during a diet, our movement often subconsciously drops to a significant degree. And this is something that many people don't pick up on unless they're doing step tracking or they're really like monitoring themselves. So I'll give a perfect example. I did a presentation for bodybuilding.com right after a contest prep season. I literally had gotten off the stage. I drove to the airport the next morning and I got on a flight. And I remember the CEO of my company, they were videoing me because this was a massive presentation in front of 400 people at bodybuilding.com. And he's videotaping me in the back. And when I get off, I had done dozens of presentations at this point. He was like, "Is everything all right?" And I'm so animated when I speak. If you watch me on video, I'm always talking with my hands. I'm constantly moving. I wasn't moving first and foremost. I did my presentation to the best of my ability, but I wasn't as loud. I wasn't as animated. I wasn't using hand gestures. And also he said I was blinking slower. And that, you may not think about that as conscious activity. It isn't, it's subconscious, but it's still burning calories. So we often see that NEAT levels, which are not just steps, they're also fidgeting, it's your postural movements, it is ambulation. As calorie intake decreases, oftentimes that will diminish. So we will see a decrease in your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or the calories burned through non-exercise activities. Now, what often happens is that will get reversed once we go back to eating at maintenance as our NEAT levels increase. So that increase in calorie intake causes us to start naturally moving more, fidgeting more, and generally being more active throughout the course of the day. And that in and of itself can significantly increase our total daily energy expenditure, because the NEAT component is actually accountable or responsible for the largest downregulation in total daily energy expenditure during metabolic adaptation. We also see that going back to maintenance can increase the calories we burn during exercise, because eating at maintenance provides the body with more energy to allocate towards training. So in my own coaching practice, when I transition clients from a deficit back to maintenance calories, I'm often going to do that through large increases in carbohydrate intake, because I really want to support training performance improvements. Now, this increase in energy availability is also going to support better training intensity, better work capacity, and greater training volume tolerance as compared to being in a deficit. Then we also know that muscle protein synthesis is suppressed during energy deficits, meaning it becomes easier to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which is the process in which we're able to add new muscle proteins. And that is actually significantly improved when energy balance is restored. So this makes periods at maintenance much more conducive to not only productive training, but also to muscle growth. So overall, eating more allows you to burn more. And that's like the whole concept behind the energy flux concept that I speak about quite often. I'm increasing. I always say we're going to eat more and we're going to move more, titrating calories up and then getting movement as a result. And so total daily energy expenditure is increasing from both the increase in food, but also the concomitant increase in activity. And we're able to really drive that person's maintenance calorie intake up. However, we can do this independently, just from getting you outside of a deficit and then increasing your calorie intake. And this creates a situation where someone can eat more food while still maintaining a lean physique, because higher energy intake allows for higher levels of energy expenditure. The other component from a metabolism perspective is we see that it helps to mitigate the downregulation in metabolic rate, because that is one of the most common things that we see during a deficit. And many people worry about this. We'll hear a lot of myths or misconceptions about dieting permanently damaging someone's metabolism. And it used to be metabolic damage that a lot of people were worried about, but now it's more this term that people utilize as weight loss resistance or metabolic resistance. But we know from pretty much every well-controlled study that the drop in metabolic rate that occurs during dieting is a temporary adaptation to being in a calorie deficit. And once energy balance is restored by eating at maintenance, RMR tends to increase. So we're going to see that restoration and metabolic rate, which generally accounts for between 60 to 70% of your total daily energy expenditure. So if you have a massive reduction because you've been underfueling yourself, you've been living in a deficit, we can see quite an uptick over time as you get back to maintenance and restore your physiology. Then the last component that I'll hit on with metabolic increases or benefits of going back to maintenance relates to hormones, because During prolonged dieting, we often see reductions in hormones associated with both energy expenditure and reproductive function, especially T3, which is the metabolically active form of thyroid hormone. And most of these hormonal downregulations are temporary adaptations to a deficit. For example, thyroid output and thyroid conversion, so the conversion of T4 into metabolically active T3, is often lowered during a deficit as a way to decrease energy expenditure and conserve calories, as T3 is heavily involved in metabolic rate and fatty acid oxidation, and then also energy expenditure. However, once we increase energy availability and return to maintenance calories for an extended period of time, we will often see that T3 increase both through greater production, but also greater conversion of T4 to metabolically active T3. So these are all ways in which getting back to maintenance can have metabolic benefits, which will all increase total daily energy expenditure and thus actually increase your maintenance calorie intake. So what was initially your maintenance calorie intake when you first go back to maintenance may not be later on down the road. And I think it's very important, like we were just alluding to, this is a range, and many things will impact that, from your activity levels to your training output to your lean mass levels, but also the whole process of getting back to maintenance may increase your maintenance for some period of time.
Yeah, dude. No, absolutely, man. And I think it just comes back to, like you said, not only are you now increasing NEAT, which is going to, like you said, that's a huge factor, especially when you drop weight, right? That's up. So you're increasing that. Your body becomes more wasteful. So you can see a huge increase there. Thermic effect of food, like you said, like that's another big one that now you're going to see that increase. And so you could see where if you don't ever get to this point, a lot of things aren't optimized from a metabolic standpoint. And this is where I think people get themselves into trouble long term. What are we looking at? I guess two things here. Would blood work be the best thing, or would we go off biofeedback? And maybe we'll hit on that earlier. And then what's the timeline that we're looking at here from this kind of, hey, you've been in a deficit to where you should start to see some of these things regulate?
Yeah, so if you look in the literature, I think the best example of this in terms of restoration of metabolic rate, first and foremost, is a study by Martins and colleagues. And what they did was they took women and they put them into a fairly massive deficit, I believe over 8 to 12 weeks. And essentially, what ends up happening is they saw a substantial reduction in resting metabolic rate. But this is like the evidence that I'll usually use when I'm thinking about metabolic damage or kind of really disentangling and dismantling that whole debate. They found that even though these women were in a massive deficit to begin with, so I think they were either on an 8 to 1,200 calorie diet, something in that sort, they lost a massive amount of weight, very significant weight loss, over 10% over 8 weeks. When they restored them and got them back to energy balance, they essentially found that within 4 weeks, that suppression and that downregulation resting metabolic rate was no longer statistically significant, meaning it almost evaporated. And so we no longer saw that. And the title of this study was something to the effect of metabolic adaptation is an illusion, which a lot of people misinterpreted, but it was a very catchy title. However, what they meant by that was metabolic adaptation is only measurable at the level of RMR in an active deficit where you're actively losing weight, losing body fat, and continuing to keep yourself in a deficit, essentially. So there's different time courses when you look into the literature, even I could say from an experience perspective. Often what I've seen is that the ability to restore a lot of these values is really dependent on the depth of the deficit, how deep did they get into a deficit, the duration of that deficit, and how lean that person got. Because a lot of these, if you look at biofeedback, it often goes in an order of how deep and how lean did you get. If someone just got lifestyle lean, you can get them back to maintenance calories and they feel good within 2, 3, 4 weeks. Whereas when someone gets into contest prep, and I'll say this from experience, I competed 15 times, you could be back at maintenance for a month. And it's almost like you're just feeling good meal by meal. But if you're still shredded, you're still not going to have restored all these values. You're still going to be in a downregulated state. And it may not be downregulated in the same sense that all components of total daily energy expenditure are lowered. However, you're still not going to be firing on all cylinders. So I think it's really important to disentangle these things. Blood work can always be done, but I will tell you this. A lot of times immediately after a very long fat loss phase or like a contest prep, I'm not pulling labs because I've done that hundreds of times with clients.
They're not going to be good.
I know what it looks like. And so I'd rather wait until we've went through a process. I take clients through what is called a metabolic restoration process. And that is going to be, and this is not a single type of process, but the metabolic restoration is dependent how significantly I increase their calories and how much of either I get them back to maintenance or of a surplus that I give them is based on how lean they got. If they were to the point that they were under their lower intervention point and shredded, eventually I'm going to have to get them into a surplus and have them regain body fat. Whereas if they got lifestyle lean, I can keep them at maintenance and keep them at this leaner state because they have not suffered the same physiological down regulations as someone that is getting into shredded conditions. So that's where really we did a conversation many years ago looking at reverse and recovery diets. It was actually a roundtable between myself, you, and Jeremiah. And I think that we all had different perspectives, but I think that my perspective at that time, and I would agree with this still to this day, the intervention that you use post diet is heavily dependent on that clientele, how far away they got from their baseline level, and then how deep into essentially physiological no man's land they got. So, for instance, if I have a woman that came to me, she's already essentially lost her menstrual cycle because she got so lean and was in such a low state of energy availability where she essentially suffered from REDS. That's not just maintenance that we're getting back to. We may stay a portion of time at maintenance, but we're going to have to eventually get into a surplus. Whereas someone that is lifestyle lean, we can get them back to maintenance. And oftentimes in 4 weeks or so, they feel great and we start seeing. Now, I will say thyroid hormones, depending on how significant of a downregulation you had, it often, like in the literature on bodybuilding case studies, it often takes 2 to 3 months to see a complete restoration of actual thyroid hormones. So these are different time courses. I think it's really important that when we look at research, I always try to give the caveat like, hey, this was a bodybuilding case study. These guys got from 15% to 4.7% body fat, as compared to someone that's going from 20% to say 12 or 13. It may not be the same time course. And unfortunately, we don't have the literature that actually shows that. What I often like to do is between week 8 to 12, post a fat loss phase or post a contest prep, I like to pull a comprehensive set of labs that are looking at a CBC, a CMP, a complete hormone profile, a complete thyroid profile. And then I'm able to see, all right, we're well on our way to making these improvements, or this person may have more of a bottleneck in this specific aspect of the physiology as I see on their blood work. And this is something we really need to maybe push harder and go above maintenance to be able to rectify this.
Yeah, dude. And I think body fat percentage is a huge variable to all this, like you just mentioned, right? And again, I think there's, generally speaking, we know what's super lean, but there is going to be a little bit of a genetic component to that too, of what people can handle. And that's where we come back to, hey, what's the person's biofeedback? And then eventually, like you said, getting some blood work to see what that looks like there. But yeah, I think the body fat percentage is a huge one in terms of where you need to go after and what that looks like. And like you said, how quickly you can return to normalcy there. But I think really to sum up this portion of it, I think you can really maximize metabolic health at maintenance, right? Like in terms of making sure you're firing on all cylinders. And I think when I say that, like long term too, right? Because a surplus, again, may be good for the short term in terms of adding muscle, but obviously you stay in a surplus too long. Now we're looking at the general population, Western world, where it's like they're in a surplus for years on end, right? And that's not going to be great from a metabolic health standpoint. So from a metabolic standpoint, I feel like in the long term, being at maintenance really can help put you in the best spot there from that standpoint.
Absolutely. All right. So let's cover some more physiological benefits. I'll start and I'll turn it over to you, but this would really encompass more of like performance and recovery benefits. And this does fall under physiology because essentially when we return or we start eating at maintenance in and of itself, it could be someone that isn't purposely dieting, but they're essentially like underfueling certain days of the week and overeating other days of the week. This is what I commonly refer to as a weekday dieter. They over restrict during the week, they overeat on the weekends, and they end up maybe in a surplus, a slight surplus or a slight deficit. They're not really fueling themselves adequately. But when we get them to eat at maintenance consistently and strategically, we can see improvements in training performance and recovery. At maintenance calories, we have more than enough fuel to push our training performance, to restore glycogen levels, and support adequate recovery. And I've seen this help clients train harder, tolerate more training volume, and then produce higher quality workouts, which is extremely important for individuals focusing on improving their physique and their performance. Then another benefit that many people overlook is the simple reality that eating more food provides the body with more energy. And that's going to have downstream ramifications. As calorie intake increases, many will notice improvements in their overall energy levels. And this extra energy is not only beneficial for our training. I think that sometimes we look at things in a really myopic viewpoint, but oftentimes I'm talking to clients about how they feel not only in the gym, but also in their day-to-day lives. And when I've gotten clients back up to maintenance, they often report that they have more energy for other things, not just the gym. It's to be more active with their families, or if they have a dog, to take them on more walks, or to stay on top of their daily responsibilities, their tasks, their chores around the house, and then to maintain a generally more active lifestyle. And one thing I've often seen is that oftentimes when I return someone to maintenance, or maybe someone comes to me brand new and they have been underfueling themselves, when I get them to what would be their theoretical maintenance, they're often living a more active lifestyle without us intentionally putting interventions there. Now, there may be things that we do from a habitual and behavioral perspective, but oftentimes we're going to see their daily movement just increase. So I might see their step count start escalating up because they have more energy in the system. They're naturally moving around more. And considering the fact that daily movement and NEAT make up a large portion of our total daily energy expenditure, having more energy throughout the day can help with maintaining a leaner body composition year round. And I think another thing that's really important from a physiological perspective is to think about the improvement that we can have in like health and biofeedback markers. A lot of times when I've taken individuals that have spent years chronically dieting and I bring them back to maintenance levels, I will see improvements in areas such as their sleep quality, their sleep duration, their stress resilience, or even their perception of stress. It may be that they're not dealing with any less stress, but their perception of how much stress they're dealing with is much lessened or it's alleviated. We're seeing better, I see better feedback from a hunger and appetite regulation perspective, and then often hormonal health, which would be through lab work. And this is because spending time at maintenance allows the body to recover from a physiological stress associated with calorie deficits or with high stress load or with poor sleep. So these are so many downstream implications and benefits that we can have from just getting back to maintenance. Now, on the physiological side, Jeff, are there any others that you see in practice or that you've read into that you think are beneficial to hit on?
You mentioned, I think for performance and like athletes, again, we're not talking someone who's trying to necessarily maximize muscle growth from like a bodybuilder standpoint, but I do think this is where you'd want those people to be most of the time, right? If you have more performance oriented goals, like you want to be here, right? For all the reasons we've mentioned so far. So I think from that standpoint, you would definitely want to do this. And then I think too, and we may have been hitting on this throughout, but you can definitely, because of all the things that we've brought up so far, it's like, this is a great place to build muscle for sure. Again, is it necessarily as good as a surplus? I would say in maybe some situations, maybe, but in most situations, a surplus is probably going to be what you would truly maximize muscle growth. You'd want to be there, but you can still build a good amount of muscle here at this point. And I think if you do have higher levels of body fat, this would be a great spot for you to really maximize muscle growth at maintenance. I think again, we've hit on this, but like you said, libido, I think this is where you could really maximize the libido side of things. And again, it comes back to the metabolic benefits of, say, your hormones and stuff like that being in a good spot. So those are the main ones. I think really hitting on the performance side of things. And if you have goals outside of just bodybuilding, this would probably be a great spot for you to be in, and probably where most people would want their athletes to be in from like a sports performance and sport aspects. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So let's move on to the behavioral benefits of eating at maintenance, because there's many physiological benefits, but eating at maintenance also provides a number of important behavioral benefits. And what I mean by that is that there are different things from a habits and behaviors perspective that we can improve during a time at maintenance much better than we could in a deficit. Many people come to us for coaching. The first thing they want is fat loss, but they don't have the fundamental habits, behaviors, and systems in place to actually be successful within that. And one of the most valuable benefits I found in practice is that being at maintenance helps clients develop better structure and routines around their nutrition, around their training, and around their lifestyle. Many people fall into this pattern, and it's a vicious one at that, where they constantly cycle between periods of restriction and underfueling and then periods of overeating and overindulging. But periods at maintenance calories provide an opportunity to step out of that cycle and practice eating in a way that is sustainable long term. And this is really what it comes back to. I was telling you this off air. One thing that I have the most frequent conversation with clients about is what I call mastering the skill of eating at maintenance. So I will use periods at maintenance to help teach the skill of eating at maintenance, which is one of the most important skills that I think is overlooked in our industry when it comes to long-term body composition success and management, essentially. I think a lot of people focus so heavily on body fat loss and don't realize that the goal of a fat loss phase is not simply to lose weight and then to regress and regain it. The goal is to maintain a leaner body composition long-term, especially if you have not gotten to an unsustainably lean point. So I find that having my clients spend periods at maintenance allows them to gain experience with what their maintenance calorie intake looks like and what it feels like in practice, like how it feels to actually execute upon it. And this is really important because they get to learn how to manage and maintain their results without reverting back to the habits that originally led to weight gain. And another component of this, and I think that this may be proof that our industry does not discuss this enough, is many people have come to me and I'm not their first coach. There's been years in the past in my coaching where the average person that came to me had 3 to 5 coaches prior to me. So they're experienced trainees. However, they've never maintained fat loss results or they've never taken a period at maintenance. Many people don't even know their maintenance calorie intake or a range. And really that is just showing that our industry really only highlights deficits and surpluses. And they think of those as the only two statuses of energy balance that can really drive change. But I've found that teaching people how to live at maintenance for a period of time not only helps from obviously a physiological perspective, but especially from a behavioral perspective, because then they can execute that and they know that they can always go back to that strategy of eating at maintenance, whether it's because life has gotten very busy or they're really happy with where they're at, or they're not interested in really pushing one side of the vector. So They may want to stay lean, but they don't want to go into a fat loss phase. They may not have the time, the energy, or the interest in allocating their mental and physical resources towards that. Or they are someone that is at the upper echelon of their muscular development. They're close to their ceiling, and they no longer see it being conducive, beneficial, or interesting to push a surplus with the high potential of fat gain, whereas they could probably build just around the same amount of muscle being at maintenance or just slightly above. So I think that these are all things that are really important to consider. One other thing that I'll say from a behavioral perspective is that I found it to significantly improve dietary adherence. So if someone is dealing with excessive diet fatigue or they're struggling with hunger, moving back to maintenance calories can make it easier to stay consistent with their nutrition plan. And that's not only something that we have to do in a phase. Like I'm not a huge proponent of very extensive periods at maintenance. It's more so like we can utilize a refeed. We can utilize a diet break. I have this terminology called a deficit deload. We can integrate this, which we'll discuss later, but these are just integrating back to maintenance to alleviate some of the symptomology and the decrements in someone's biofeedback that we can alleviate through going back to maintenance. So I think that this is really important to hit on because it's great to just look at the physiology, but we are humans out in the real world. This is a free, like life is a free living study, essentially. You're not in a metabolic ward. And so we really have to consider what can people integrate and what would be the most beneficial things that we can work on with clientele that when they're at different periods or they're on a vacation or they're stressed in their day-to-day lives, they can actually turn to and lean upon. And that really comes down to habits and behaviors, and maintenance is a great time to cement those.
And that's why I like to call a phase like this, even though I still like to call it a building phase because like you're still building habits and you're still building these things. And I think it's more important to continue to build these things outside of a fat loss phase, right? Because it's like you said, people just completely lose. They're like, oh, I'm not in a deficit, so I'm just going to do whatever. And it's, yeah, I mean, we need to work on these things during that time because otherwise you end up being, like you said, you just go back to that kind of cycle where you just go back to dieting all the time. So just, yeah, this is a great time to build your habits, keep a lot of those habits. When I think also a lot of people don't realize that this is a good time we've been talking about how the benefits of performance. This is a good time to have performance related goals during this time, right? Because we know that one, they'll be better, but it's also a good thing to switch your mindset to those, right? You talk about high energy flux. Like this is a great time to really focus on, hey, yeah, you're not dieting, but let's still keep your movement up high, right? There's going to be a ton of benefits from that. So continuing to build your habits during this time, I think is super important because if you can learn how to manage this period of time, like you've nailed it long term, right? If you can nail this time. And like you said, again, I always come back to the body fat percentage being super important here. Because again, if you're trying to stay super lean, you probably are going to struggle with that. And I always tell people like outside of fat loss, my goal, I want to get you to the weight range that you feel good. And it's not a huge barrier to you sticking to it. And I think that comes to the behavior side of things of building habits around that and living that lifestyle and learning how to do that. So yeah, man.
Absolutely. All right. So we are on to our final category, which are the psychological benefits of eating at maintenance. So the first thing from a psychological perspective that I find to be very advantageous is eating at maintenance can help with reducing diet fatigue. So fat loss dieting in and of itself often requires a higher level of decision making, higher levels of restraint, and mental effort. And none of those things are bad because that's actually what allows you to be successful in the fat loss phase themselves. But over time, this can lead to diet fatigue. And one thing that I see are people inducing unnecessary levels of diet fatigue by trying to extend dieting and fat loss approaches for far too long. So getting back to maintenance can allow individuals to mentally reset and recover from the psychological demands of dieting. And this is very applicable whether you are someone transitioning out of the fat loss phase or you're someone that has large aspirational goals. So that could be getting into stage condition or photo shoot condition. And you're doing a lot of times when I'm taking a newer competitor through a contest prep period, we're doing a building phase first, but then I'm doing a pre-prep phase. So it is a dieting phase, but then I'm getting them back to maintenance after, restoring things, and then we're going into the contest prep. So I break these up into phases in and of themselves. The same thing could be said for someone that has a very large weight or fat loss goal, where doing it in one foul swoop, essentially, one fat loss phase would just be very disadvantageous. It would expose them to a massive degree of metabolic adaptation or biofeedback, and most likely would lead to a very poor level of adherence, especially towards the end. I really think that over 10 to maybe 15% weight loss, doing it in one phase is just not advantageous. I understand that in some of the trials in terms of GLP-1s, we're now seeing much higher than that. But even if you look at semaglutide, the Wilding trial, the average weight loss over 68 weeks, which is well over a year, that is like about 14, 15 months, was somewhere in the realm of 15.1%. So we see even with some of the most powerful, this was semaglutide, but one of the most powerful weight loss drugs that we have available to us, there is still somewhat of a cap to how much people can lose in one period of time continuously. And so when I've had individuals that have 20, 30% of body weight loss that would be beneficial for them, we're not talking about just getting them shredded. It is that they are living with excess adiposity, which is actually hindering their quality of life and their metabolic health. I often will break that up into stages. And one of the benefits of getting back into a period, whether that's a 6 to 8 week quote unquote diet break, or I call it a deficit deload, where I get them back up to maintenance, is they practice what it's like living in between those phases. So they're not just mastering the skill of restricting themselves and eating less, they're mastering the skill of actually maintaining a specific calorie range, maintaining the specific habits, behaviors necessitated to live leaner than they have previously, but it also allows them to drop off that diet fatigue. And then another thing that I find is once I've helped a client master eating at maintenance, they report that they have an improved confidence around their nutrition, which leads to an increase in self-efficacy. So in practice, I find it really helpful to show clients that they can eat more food while maintaining their body composition, as it builds confidence in their ability to maintain the results, which is something so many people have not been able to do in the past. So they really don't know if it's possible. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, have come to you, Jeff, where they have a narrative in their head that they're a failure. They failed a lot of fat loss phases in the past. They've never been successful. So they hyper focus on those failures rather than looking at this as learning lessons. Yes, you've made mistakes in the past. You have extended dieting phases too long, or you haven't had a post-diet phase in place. And so you went from one extreme to the other where you were chronically restricting yourself and then you overindulged after, or you set up a fat loss phase right before a cruise and you excessively ate on a cruise and rebounded. A lot of people will associate, instead of seeing those as isolated incidences or phases that were not successful or were successful to a certain point, they essentially associate themselves with that failure. And what I really find is getting a period where I could teach someone to live at maintenance, eat more food, but realize that they're maintaining their body composition or even improving their body composition. It's almost liberating to them from a psychological perspective, where they realize that they are capable, first and foremost, that they can do this. And then it often spurs greater progress in the future because now they're not scared to go through different phasic structures of these are individuals that are now then bought into, hey, we're going to go through a building phase. And for a particular period of time, we're not going to worry about your body weight. We're going to worry about your training performance and gaining lean mass. Then we're going to transition into a holding phase and hold the heightened level of muscle mass that you have. And we're going to make sure that training performance continues improving. And then we'll eventually go into a deficit where, and they're not scared to go into different phases of the body composition improvement process. Whereas in the past, it was either fat loss or bust because they never maintained the results in the past. So they always feared doing anything other than fat loss because they associated that with something that was putting them in a position to fail rather than a position to succeed.
Yeah, dude, absolutely, man. I think the flexibility side of things in terms of people don't realize how much more flexibility they can have at maintenance. Again, we still have to, like we talked about, you still want to maintain good habits, but you have a lot more. I think people realize they have more flexibility than they think. It's like, hey, you don't have to eat 1,600 calories all year long. It's like that. There's a lot of, like you said, the diet fatigue of that weighs on somebody over time. And I think also from a diet fatigue standpoint, like your brain just literally the leaner you get, the longer you diet, your brain just like everything pushes you towards getting back to maintenance, right? Everything's just going to push you. And it's subconsciously, you're going to want to eat more. You're going to not want to move your body's okay. Let's freaking get back to it. I think the psychological benefit of that is super important. So more flexibility, but you also mentioned that people will try and go through it just try and get it all off at one time. And like you said, they can totally do it, but that's where you probably see higher amounts of weight regain following that. And if you're not taking those breaks like you're talking about, that's probably where you see people lose a little bit more lean body mass on the way down. And those probably go hand in hand too, right? Where like you're more likely to regain afterwards as well too. So from that standpoint, yeah, dude, I think that's why we want to do that and build those into these fat loss phases in between fat loss phases to do these, because otherwise you're going to run into that issue there, which psychologically is going to lead down to a lot of issues where you're thinking, hey, diet doesn't work or fitness stuff doesn't work. And it's a huge trickle down effect from there.
Absolutely. All right. So you just led me right into our last topic, my friend. And the last topic I'd like to discuss are how periods of eating at maintenance across the year in between phases can be integrated, because I believe it's really beneficial to strategically implement periods at maintenance throughout the year as part of a well-structured body composition improvement plan. So we'll go through each type of phase. I'll start off like during fat loss phases, I will often integrate short periods at maintenance which can reduce diet fatigue. They could restore training performance on a transient level, meaning it's temporary, but it could also improve adherence. And we see that both in practice, but we see it in the research. When we look at like the diet break literature, really the most profound improvements that we see are psychological benefits. So disinhibition or reductions in appetite, or essentially downstream implications from a psychological perspective that would lead someone to be more adherent. So this is where things like diet breaks or refeeds, I do something called the deficit deload, where I really pull
I
back
like that.
on all physiological stressors. And I really term it that. I've been utilizing that term for many years because I realized that there was a negative connotation with diet breaks. I understand that in the literature, that is correct. So we look at Wing and Jeffrey from 2003. They started the diet break concept. Lyle, a friend of mine, brought that to the masses in Flexible Dieting, his book from 2005. But I've just found so many times that even when I give comprehensive instructions about a diet break, or I ask clients at this point, now I don't even assume that they know what these things are, but I have a conversation. I say, what is your knowledge or interpretation of what a diet break is? And it's like, all bets are off. It's like going back to my old foods and stuff. So I use a deficit deload. It's very structured, but it is a time of going back to maintenance for an extended period of time. So that could be 7 to 14 days. And really, we're trying to restore some physiological markers in terms of like how they feel, how they perform, how they're functioning, but really from a psychological perspective, really gearing them up for that next subsequent push back into a deficit. Now, in terms of fat loss phases, are there any other times that you find it to be advantageous during the fat loss phase itself to utilize times at maintenance?
Like you said, I think the refeed days, the diet breaks, like you said, and they don't have to, I don't think they necessarily have to be a certain amount of days. It can literally be as many days as you want and as many days as you need. Now, obviously the downside is we'll just slow down fat loss, but that could be exactly what you need to keep pushing forward anyways. And I really like the concept. I like that you said it as a fat loss deload, because it really is like a deload of training almost in a way, just right. It's like like you said, you're just taking stress off the body with that. And it does all those benefits that we talked about from the psychological side of things. So within a fat loss phase, those would be the two biggest times that I would use it in terms of a refeed. And again, I don't know if maybe we want to hit on when we would, what would be the signs of that. So I guess if someone's super depleted or they're just feeling super stressed, like that would be a time that you'd want to go back to maintenance calories, maybe like a higher resting heart rate, just subjective, like fatigue, et cetera, would probably be what I would look at there.
Yeah, and I think those are great points. I think another thing for me is how long has this person been in a deficit? What is their experience dieting? And where are we at in the timeline of where we're trying to get? So, for instance, a lot of times when I am dealing with someone, I am getting leaner, it's for one of three situations. It's a contest prep, it's a photo shoot prep, or it is an event prep, which would mean a wedding, a big birthday, something like that. So I always have to back calculate. That does not mean that I can't be reactive in terms of my integration of these strategies, but I always have to be more cognizant of the overall timeline. So for me, it really is looking how far away are they from their goals? Is this going to be beneficial, or especially in terms of the time length perspective? So deficit deload, if I have a very long time period to someone's goal, I can integrate that because I can do 7 to 14 days and realize that fat loss progress will not be made during this time. It's not going to cause metabolic magic. But we have the timeline in place, and that's often why I will tell you personally, when I prep competitors or photo shoot clients, I will often, the timeline that I give is always 2 weeks longer than it needs to be. Reason for that is I often will bring people back up to maintenance, and I don't use the colloquial reverse diet in terms of my post-diet phases, but I will reverse someone into the show where I will strategically and quite frequently titrate their calories up in as we get in closer proximity to the event, the show, or the photo shoot. And I found that to be really advantageous because we're essentially dissipating a lot of the accumulated fatigue, both from a physical and a mental perspective, that was accumulated over the course of that prep, of getting them leaner than ever. And then I start seeing that their body just looks fresher as I'm increasing, especially carbohydrates. I'm increasing carbohydrates. They're getting fuller, but it doesn't need to be something drastic like a massive carb load on a single day or 2 days. This could be over a 2-week long period. So that's the only other time that I utilize one of these strategies, essentially during a fat loss phase itself.
Yeah, I think too, again, the sooner somebody or the more recent somebody started a fat loss phase and the higher their body fat levels are, you wouldn't necessarily need to do it. It would just simply at that point be based on their biofeedback and be like, hey, we don't need to take one, but it could be something from a psychological standpoint that benefits you. But whereas I think somebody, the longer they diet, the leaner they are, it probably does become a bit more beneficial to do it a little bit more often. And then, like you said, reverse up from there if you have the time to be able to do that, which is awesome because then you get to fill out, you look lean. And that's what I feel like you look your best.
Absolutely. No, I think a great analogy to this, before we move on to the next, I was at a conference last April and it was for the Sports Nutritionists Association. And Eric Treskler Trexler was presenting on metabolic adaptation. I've actually had him on my podcast since that time. But he made an analogy that when it comes to refeeds and diet breaks, it's best applied to those that are getting very lean. And the reason for that, the analogy he gave was that why would you buy bee repellent if you don't have bees? So why would you utilize one of these strategies if you haven't gotten extremely lean or you've not induced great degrees of metabolic adaptation, because we are trying to offset these things. So I thought that was a great analogy.
I like it.
And we will now go to after a fat loss phase. So one massive benefit that could be had by spending time at maintenance after a fat loss phase is we're going to help reverse the diet-induced metabolic adaptations induced through the deficit, but also we can help prevent rapid fat regain. So I really find that getting right back to maintenance for many clients is the move first and foremost. But if someone has only gotten lifestyle lean, I can often keep them around that maintenance energy intake. And we just work on improving training performance, improving their sleep quality, and all the other biofeedback metrics, which may have been somewhat thrown off during the deficit itself. But really, during this time period, I'm really trying to continue to reinforce a lot of the habits and behaviors that they developed during the diet that led them to success. So choosing high volume foods and protein forward types of anchored eating, making sure they're getting their fiber intake in, making sure they're prioritizing whole foods that are nutrient dense, that are satiating, not looking at what, if it fits your macros creation, can I make, and how can I macro hack my way to getting my target macros. These are things that I find to be very advantageous after a fat loss phase. But really, the first thing we need to do, or in my opinion, the first thing that needs to be done is getting back to your maintenance and really being able to restore energy balance, increase energy availability, offset those diet-induced metabolic adaptations so you can start feeling better, you can start functioning better, and we can really start driving performance back up. Because oftentimes, if you've gotten very lean, or even if you haven't gotten super lean, you're lifestyle lean, but it's taking you a long time to get lifestyle lean. You've been in a deficit for a long period of time, you are going to see some type of decrement in your training performance. So we want to be able to restore that and recover that as soon as possible.
Yeah. Yep. Getting back to maintenance and working your way back to that post-fat loss. And again, I think you hit on this, but body fat percentage, again, is going to be super key in terms of, I think, how quick you get back to that point, and probably the psychology of the person that you're doing that
100%.
with as well, too, is going to be key. I don't know if we hit on this, but I guess another time I would use it would be in between fat loss phases, right? So
Absolutely.
maybe we were going to hit on this. I don't know. I could be jumping ahead here on this, but like in between fat loss phases where somebody has to lose more than 10 to 20%, or I'm sure you've done this. I've never done this myself and I want to try it, but I've worked on it with some clients where get them down and then maybe they are relatively lean, but it's like you want to get leaner. It's like taking a break in between there can be super helpful. So using maintenance calories in between the fat loss phases, like we talked about, would be super helpful and important to from a body comp perspective, the psychology side of things, the metabolic aspects and everything like that there.
So I will tell you that integrated approach where we're integrating strategic periods at maintenance in between fat loss phases is something I've done with sequential fat loss phases. That's the best way I can describe them. I've done that for myself in both photo shoot and then also contest preps for myself and then with certain athletes. And why I've done that is when there is a period where I need to get ready for a very important event, whether that be a photo shoot or that be a prep or like an actual contest earlier on in a season, but it's too long for me to continue in a linear deficit to get to my next goal and not actually diminish the look. So a few examples for this. I've had certain photo shoot seasons where it was early summer where I had a very large shoot. So I might have landed a magazine or a calendar, but my main shoot that was my target date, which was also just as important, ended up being 8 to 10 weeks later. So theoretically, if I needed to be in close to photo shoot shape or basically photo shoot shape, it may take me 12 weeks to get to that period in maybe June. But to hang on for another 8 to 10 weeks of that same deficit, I would be immensely depleted and I probably would look worse. I would probably hemorrhage more muscle. I would look flatter. It would be hard to get back. There is this stringy type of worn out, tired look, especially when you get very low in body fat, that it's very difficult to restore. And you're not going to do it through carb load or refeed. And so I've taken a linear approach or an undulating linear or non-linear approach essentially. So what it would look like, and I'm making this graph in my hands, is I would do a fat loss phase and get to a certain point where I could be in reasonable shape for the goal, the target. So I get here and then I go right back to maintenance and I stay there until I'm within a distance of time or a time length that is within striking distance that I can go back into a deficit for a short period of time and still get in even better condition. What I've noticed with that personally is that in comparison to the times that I have done 20-week preps, the whole duration of the diet may be the same. I may have been technically in a deficit that year for 20 weeks, but breaking it up has just made it more sustainable. I've often maintained training performance much better. And I've just noticed that the biofeedback indices, especially for me, I'm someone, and we've discussed this on our own podcast about my fat loss phase. I suffer quite heavily from a sleep perspective, where once I get to a certain body fat percentage, usually under 8%, my sleep goes to shit. I can use all the sleep supplementation, all the hacks, all the hygiene. It's just something I'm physiologically, maybe hereditarily predisposed to. My father had terrible sleeping habits. However, when I've done those integrated and those non-linear dieting strategies for the same type of condition, it hasn't been as bad. Now, getting to 5% body fat and under, that
Sucks.
It always sucks. It sucks every time. I'm never going to lie to you about that. But that is something that I have utilized, and it can be beneficial given someone's time length. Now I would look at it differently. I think when I used to do that back in the day, it was because a lot of times I had to qualify for a show in March or April while I had the time allotted to me from work, but then I wouldn't compete on a national show until June. And so there was too long of a time length. It was 10 weeks in between to just stay in a linear deficit. I had to restore myself, get myself back up, get better training performance, and then get back into it maybe 6 weeks out.
When you're that lean, though, do you ever really, at that point, you probably don't fully restore things, right? You're probably still in somewhat of you're probably not fully restoring. So in that situation, that's where you'd want to eventually get that person back to a surplus to get back to better body fat levels. But you could probably pull this off with someone they're going from 15 to 20% down to, say, 10%. And you could pull that, and it wouldn't necessarily be as stressful on the body, correct? And
I will say this. You feel substantially better during that duration you go back to maintenance. And another person that I've actually had conversations about this on the podcast have been Eric Helms, about his preps, where he's had very long preps, but he's actually essentially done multiple shows, but they tend to be quite extended from one another because WNBF Worlds is like usually in November, but he'll start his season in July. So this is a very extensive time period, and a natural prep already is very long. And he's getting in shredded condition for that first show. And then essentially he's like reversing back up, and he's eating a higher intake for the majority. And then sometimes he'll dip down for 2 or 3 week periods at a time. He's still in a net deficit, but it's not as significant and severe of a deficit as he was in the beginning of his prep, or like in the beginning leading into the first show. And you feel substantially better. Now, here's the thing. You will feel substantially better in that moment. You'll feel substantially better for your meals and during those days in comparison to where you were at the depths of your diet. However, you never notice, or I will say this personally, I never noticed how still down-regulated I was until I went back into maintenance and a surplus. So it isn't until the prep, whether it be for the photo shoot or the actual contest ends, that I realized, because a lot of times I would be 4 to 6 weeks back up to maintenance in between those blocks where I would have contests or photo shoots. And I felt great in my mind. You know what I mean? I felt great on a day-to-day because in comparison to what I just went through to get lean, it feels amazing. However, when then I'm look at it in retrospect, once I'm 2 or 3 months post-diet, and I start having things come back online that I didn't even realize had not come back online in that previous phase, I realized, oh, you were still pretty down-regulated. But in that moment, you don't notice, honestly.
yeah, just having more calories and you're just pushing through, and just the probably act of more calories helps offset some of that. But you're not fully restored, especially just because, again, it's the body fat levels that are going to play the big role there with that. So that makes sense.
Another context in which I will utilize maintenance or spending time in maintenance will be during a building phase. If I have someone doing an extensive building phase, and oftentimes I'll take people 6 to 9 months in a building phase, especially when they have very substantial muscle gain that they want to develop, or their competitors. So we are really spreading this out in terms of that they're not cutting on a frequent basis. And so what I will do oftentimes is I will pull them back to eat at maintenance to restore things like insulin sensitivity or to improve their nutrient partitioning. And also I found this to be very advantageous to provide relief from the digestive stress that can sometimes come from prolonged surpluses. So this can be done actually in a singular day basis. There have been times I've integrated a low calorie day, whether that be at maintenance or even a deficit, on one particular day per week, which is an off training day during a building phase, or I've just transitioned them to 1 to 2 weeks. I will literally do almost like a surplus deload. I actually have not called it that. I should probably call it that at this point.
Just the opposite.
I will literally pull them down almost to like a surplus break, essentially, and just pull them back down to their maintenance calorie intake so that then they're able to get an alleviation from, a lot of times it's just the burden. Like they don't have an appetite. Like I have a guy right now that I just transitioned into prep, but he was on 4,700 calories and 800 plus grams of carbohydrates a day. At one point, we were starting to lose appetite. He never got to the point where he was like completely stuffed. But if we had pushed it, and obviously I back calculated all the time lengths, but say I'd made this phase 2 or 3 months longer, we would have hit a bottleneck in which I would have had to bring him to maintenance. So these are just examples where we can utilize maintenance in other ways that many people may not think of. I think the same thing can be said I think the best usage of maintenance calories is actually used during a body recomposition phase where we're trying to gain muscle and also slowly reduce body fat. And that's going to be most advantageously done initially, at least at maintenance, because many people do have enough body fat on their frame where they're able to use that as an endogenous energy source that they can pull from to fuel the muscle growth and the recovery processes. And then we can just top them up right back to maintenance in terms of exogenous energy that they're taking in through food. So I think that a lot of times people only look, and this is why I really wanted to go through this, they'll only look at maintenance as something that we go to like after a fat loss phase, but it could be integrated during a fat loss phase, after a fat loss phase, during a building phase, in between fat loss phases, like you brought up, during recomp phases. I think that this is something that could be utilized much more frequently and for much more benefits that many people realize.
Yeah, dude, those were the two that I wanted to go over. It was during a building phase when we could use it there. Like you said, it's like you maybe you're in a small surplus for a period of time, and then you get to a body weight where, again, it's just like you're feeling good, like body comp is still in a decent spot, and you feel good, performance as well. I think that's a great time to transition to maintenance. Like you said, now it's like, for all the reasons you just mentioned, you have a little bit more body fat on you. And so you're good to go at that point. You don't need to keep pushing body weight up. That's a huge mistake I used to make in my building phases. Is I just kept going up and up. And it's, wait, I didn't need to do that. And I probably just gained a bunch of extra body fat that I didn't need to. Obviously, being careful with that, making sure that if you really have lofty muscle gain goals, don't cut that short too early. I think you could, but again, using it there. But like you also said, I think the huge one is building maintenance at building phases for people that have higher body fat levels. I think that's a great utilization of this, because that's where people can get themselves in this no man's land of, they feel like they're not necessarily as lean as they want to get yet, but then they're like, oh, I want to build muscle, so I need to go into a surplus. So then they gain extra body fat, and so you don't even need to do that. And now you're going to have to spend more time fat loss dieting later. So I think those are great people to be able to utilize that with, is just higher body fat levels. And I personally believe that, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, there's always going to be, I think it depends on who you work with, but I think from a female physiology standpoint, I think honestly, the more times you can spend at maintenance throughout the year, the better it's going to be from that standpoint. Obviously, the leaner you are, you probably want to gain a little bit of body fat to really be good from a muscle building standpoint. But I feel like being around maintenance most of the time is just going to be great for a lot of things from a female perspective there.
First and foremost, periods at maintenance, I use most frequently with women. I'm working with, at this point, a little bit more women than I am men from a like a statistical perspective in terms of like my percentages on my roster. But I will say a few things about that. First and foremost, many of the women that come to me have a lengthy history of dieting, and it has not served them. They may have been lean in the past, but now they're dealing with hormonal downregulations or poor biofeedback or not enough muscle. Like the biggest thing that maybe the biggest goal that women come to me with, and I've been successful in helping them achieve this, is getting them to look like they lift, but in a way that's actually healthy. Because a lot of times what they've done is they've always hit the fat loss hammer. It's always going into a deficit to improve their body composition, rather than realizing that oftentimes it wasn't that they needed to get that much leaner. It was that they needed more lean muscle mass to actually display the physique that they were looking for. And so being at maintenance is a great period, because first and foremost, psychologically, a lot of women are adamantly against a surplus unless they involuntarily or they inadvertently fall into a surplus because of their weekend habits. They're not trying to eat in a surplus. They don't want to feel overly full. They don't want to feel like they're gaining body fat. They're fearful of that, and I understand that. What I often try to do is get women back into maintenance, and I see this expression to many of the women I work with. I want to transition you from a state and a mindset of restriction and subtraction into a mindset of abundance and addition. We're adding things. We're adding in more protein, more fruits and vegetables. We're adding reps and sets. It's really like an additive model rather than the normal female model that is marketed to them, which is subtraction based. It is, let's see your scale weight going down. You should be a smaller, scrawnier version of yourself. Many women don't want that anymore. They want to look like they lift. They want lean muscle. They want a physique that actually has curves and shape to them, and that requires muscle. So I do think that being at maintenance is incredibly advantageous from a female physiology perspective. The other thing that I think is often overlooked, and I think one day we're going to have to do a body recon podcast. If you look into the literature, and I've combed through this quite extensively, I believe based on the evidence, women have a higher predisposition and a higher likelihood of recomp than men. I'll say this for multiple reasons. First and foremost, women have higher starting body fat percentages survivally, like from a survival perspective in terms of essential body fat, first and foremost, but also behaviorally. They tend to carry more body fat. If we look at the average body fat of a woman in the States, it's 40% body fat as compared to men, which is 28%. So women have more exogenous fuel on their body to be able to, or endogenous fuel on their body to be able to be available to recomp, to fuel that process. Secondarily, many women have underfueled themselves in terms of total calorie intake, but also specifically on protein. So they're usually eating less protein than men. Third, they may be very well trained in terms of their actual years in the gym, but a lot of them have not spent time in an actual hypertrophy specific training. So it's more of a novel stimulus to them where they're usually very aerobically fit. They may be very well trained from a lower body perspective, but often their upper body has a lot of room to actually gain muscle, to gain more back width, especially like in their delts. A lot of them are untrained in those things. And so they have all the factors from a physiological perspective, higher body fat percentage. Even if we look at like a protein oxidation perspective, they actually spare protein better than men do. So there's many physiological reasons as to why women would be more likely to be able to achieve body recomposition, which could be done at maintenance. It just necessitates the right strategy, the right programming, the right push, because a lot of women have yet to achieve that on their own because they haven't sufficiently fueled themselves. They haven't pushed themselves very hard in the gym to the point that they're uncomfortable. You may have to make ugly faces. You're going to have to push yourself. You may have to sweat. Like, these are things that, don't worry about who's judging in the gym because no one cares. Like, you are going to care what you look like when you look at yourself and when you go out to the beach and stuff. No one else cares. No one cares what you look like in the gym. But if you want to earn that body that you're proud of and that you're confident in, you got to put in the work in the gym. So it's really reframing their mindset, getting them into a state where they're eating appropriately. And I do think that oftentimes it's both from a physiological and psychological perspective, it's very advantageous to really preach a lot of maintenance. I'll just say this from a experience perspective from coaching, that I will get women into extensive maintenance phases in terms of not maintenance in and of itself. It may be a primer phase, it may be a recomp phase, but I will keep them around their maintenance because I see such vast benefits from a body composition perspective, but also from a mental perspective where they no longer fear food. They're no longer fearing carbohydrates. They don't fear fat gain because they actually see body composition improvements. And that causes them to not feel like every time they're unhappy with their body composition, they have to go right back into a diet, nor does it cause them to think that they are unable to achieve the goals that they've been looking for. Because a lot of times women will come to me and say, I want to look like I lift. I'm putting all this effort in. I feel like I'm doing everything right, but they're underfueling themselves. So they're in a deficit. They're hindering their muscle growth progress, and they're also not training sufficiently well. So these things all stack up on one another. And many times women may think, I don't have the ability to build this physique I'm looking for, when in actuality, the deck has not been stacked in their favor. So I do think that it is massively beneficial for everyone to spend time at maintenance. But if I could send a message out there to the demographic that is going to maintenance least, but could benefit from it most, it's you ladies out there.
Absolutely, dude. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I like too I like that if they spent a lot of time under fueling, or maybe it's like a very like up and down fueling strategy, right? Whereas you can get them to fuel enough regularly, it's like they have this whole like wiggle room to be able to grow and build muscle from that. And then on top of it, you also brought up a good point of they also have a lot of wiggle room from a training standpoint to really maximize that. They haven't, and they have definitely not done both of those together at the same time there. And then again, to come back to the body fat levels, right? Like you said, women do need a higher baseline of body fat, but they do have that extra body fat. So it's like, we need to use that. And we've talked about this before, but I think it was the Levine study where they just naturally had people get into a surplus and they looked at NEAT levels. And it was like the women were there was like, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but it was like 10 subjects, 8 of them were male, two were female. And the females were the 2 at the lowest that increased their NEAT. Like they didn't increase their NEAT, or it was like the lowest compared to everyone.
So what we saw in that specific study, and now mind you, that's a massive surplus. The Levine study is from the 90s. They put them in 1,000 calorie surplus for 8 weeks. So every single day, 1,000 calories over, that's a 7,000 calorie surplus per week. And what they found was that the average individual upregulated energy expenditure from the non-exercise activity component by 328 calories per day. Now, there was a male that upregulated to the point that he was almost 700 calories just from NEAT. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean he just increased his total daily energy expenditure by 700. We have to consider that the thermic effect of eating, it generally accounts for 10%. So that's 100 calories out of that 1,000 calorie surplus. Then we also saw an increase in resting metabolic rate. There's a great study by Harris that sees that in 1,000 calorie surplus, you can see an upregulation in energy expenditure from resting metabolic rate anywhere between 5 to 15%. So let's go with 10. So that person, and this was actually the subject, that male that upregulated NEAT by 700 calories, he ended up swallowing almost the entire surplus and gained somewhere in the realm of 2 pounds. Whereas theoretically, if you just look from a mathematics perspective, over that 8 weeks, they should have been gaining 2 pounds per week for 16 pounds over that 8-week period. Now, here's the thing. The caveat to that study is that there were 2 or 3 females in that study. We saw that particular people in response to an energy surplus of that magnitude actually downregulated energy expenditure. And 2 individuals that did so were females, and one decreased energy expenditure up to 98 calories. That didn't mean that she netted essentially 1,098 calories, because there was still an increase in resting metabolic rate and thermic effect of feeding, but she essentially gained a precipitous amount of weight. This isn't to say that every woman is going to, when going into surplus, gain fat. It's just that if you're not training hard, you're not increasing activity, and you're eating in excess, women may be more predisposed towards storing body fat. We also see that from an enzymatic perspective. Women have a very interesting fat storage pattern in terms of how they store it. They have a gynoid fat pattern, which is in the lower body. But even if you look at fuel oxidation, how women take and metabolize nutrients and then re-sequester them after eating, or say in the case of, say you were to break down body fat through the oxidation process. So you go and do low intensity aerobic work, and you have essentially increased lipolysis, which they break down a fat from the fat tissue. It now needs to get transported into the mitochondria to be burned off. If you don't utilize all those fatty acids that have been liberated from the fat tissue, and all that means is like you have stored fat in fat tissue, in adipose tissue, and you break it down and you essentially cleave 3 fatty acids away from a glycerol backbone. You get those 3 fatty acids floating through the bloodstream. Women are better at mobilizing fat, and they tend to rely more off of fatty acid metabolism. So that sounds like a good thing. You should burn more fat. But if you're burning less calories for that session as compared to a male, because you have a lower body weight and a lower resting metabolic rate, if you're increasing fatty acid metabolism and mobilization, but you're not actually burning that, those fatty acids that have been liberated now go through the process of re-esterification, meaning they get restored in fat tissue. Here's the thing. Women will tend to re-esterify fatty acids, sometimes from the upper body. They will liberate them from the upper body, store them in the lower body. So there used to be a comment that was 1 minute on the lips equals a lifetime on the hips. What they meant by that was you eat in excess of, say, chocolates or things like that, it ends up in your lower body. And there is some physiological basis to that. So it's not that women cannot go into surplus. I will say this. Anytime that I have a woman do a building phase, it is specifically a lean building phase, meaning a small, slight surplus. I want to use the smallest surplus that leads to gains over time, both in terms of performance, lean mass, and then I do want to see body weight trend up over time, but I do not recommend going above 0.25 to 0.5% body weight per week in any women, just because it would be a very precipitous weight gain where it's going to lead to psychological effects where they don't feel great in their skin. And often it's going to deter them from completing the phase. And really, when it comes down to it, muscle growth is a very long process. So if we try to accelerate it by pushing the gas in terms of how many calories we eat and the rate of gain, most times people are just going to get uncomfortable and call the plug it and essentially call it before they actually gained enough muscle. So I'd rather have a small surplus, a lot of runway, both from a physiological perspective in terms of your body fat levels, your body composition, and your comfort, and then run that as long as possible while you still have productive training, you're fueled adequately, you're pushing yourself hard in the gym, you're progressively overloading, and try to accumulate as much muscle over time in a slow and steady manner.
Yeah, dude. No, absolutely. I think with that study, like you said, that was just subconscious need, right? If you're actively going out and moving and doing all the things we're talking about and training hard, that's completely different.
And there was no training in this study.
No training, right? So that's completely different. And I think it does just go to show, though, that women, when faced with a surplus, and this is a physiological thing, right? I just think they're more prone to, because from a physiological standpoint, from a fertility standpoint, like having a little bit more body fat is probably going to be beneficial. Obviously, up until a point with everybody, right? But I think that's just how female physiology is. And like you said, definitely, that's not to say don't ever do a surplus and you're just going to gain a bunch of body fat. But I think it just shows that's just how physiology works from a female perspective there. And it's all about our inputs and everything like that. Two other times real quick that I want to go over that I would use maintenance calories would be during busy seasons. So if you have a super busy time going on, like I think that's a great time for it. And then finally, again, if you are on a heavy performance period of time where it's strictly performance, whether that be like a run like that, or again, if you're an athlete and you have a season or something like that, like maintenance is where you'd want to be with that, right? Like you'd want to save your body comp pushes and stuff like that for the off season and away from competitions and stuff. So those would be the other times I would use maintenance calories.
Absolutely, man. I'm in complete agreement with that. All right, so we will wrap this one up here. Jeff, before we wrap this up for sure, let the audience know, where is the best place they can find you, my friend?
Yeah, man, this was fun. We went a little bit over, but we got into a good topic there at the end, and so we ran with it. Best place, Mind Muscle Connection Podcast, and then Instagram, Jeff, H-O, and it's Hain. You got it right this time. I love it.
I had to improve upon it. Only took a few years, my friend.
Dude,
Getting better by the week.
nobody ever gets it, so I don't care. I just give you trouble.
Awesome. All right, guys.
What about you, man?
guys can catch me. The best places are three ways. First and foremost, feel free to check out daily educational content at Brandon DaCruz_, which can be found on Instagram. The other is my email, which I'm always available to take questions or to take inquiries. That is bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. And then for weekly podcast deep dives like this one, you can find me at the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. This is available on Spotify and iTunes. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in to the second edition of our collaboration podcast between the Chasing Clarity podcast and the Mind to Muscle Connection podcast. Guys, please feel free to share the show. If you do, make sure to tag myself and Jeff in your stories. Let us know what you liked from us, and also give us feedback as to whether you'd rather us do a Q&A type of episode as we did in the first edition, which was released last month, or if you like these topic deep dives, and we will take that into consideration and make sure that we're doing what you guys really are looking forward to moving forward. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you guys on the next edition. I'll see you on the next edition of Chasing Clarity. Jeff will see you on the next edition of Mind and Muscle Connection. However, we will see you back again for this coaching roundtable in 1 month's time.
Yes, sir.
Take it easy. Peace.
See ya.